Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly wild and fascinating piece of writing. We're looking at a text that basically tries to smash together two massive, incredibly complex fields, abstract quantum mechanics and deep fundamental theology. It's this wild conceptual framework where mathematical variables literally meet spiritual salvation. The whole point? To decode the actual mechanics of God's judgment, what the author calls the quantum equation of divine justice. So buckle up.
Okay, let's just dive right into this. I know, blending physics and theology sounds super dense, but don't worry, we're going to map the whole thing out clearly, piece by piece. We'll start with the two worlds, move into the binary spirit, explore the cycle of crime, examine a pretty intense psychological quantum game, and finally, look at the ultimate divine test.
All right, part one, the two worlds.
Right out of the gate, the author sets up a major theological paradigm by splitting reality into two totally distinct realms. First, you have the classical world. Here, the theology is completely passive for us humans. Every instance of suffering is measured directly by God, and God dispenses the justice. Simple enough, right? But then, over in the quantum world, the text completely flips the script. Now, the human mind actually has to measure the suffering. We're forced into this active role where we have to seek God to trigger that justice. It's a huge shift, going from a passive recipient of divine law to an active participant.
And this active participation, it goes way deeper than you might think. The text explicitly states, given a page, there are finite emotional states. I shifted my consciousness, and it made the whole page. So, in this quantum theological framework, consciousness itself literally creates reality. Just by shifting focus, the observer collapses all these swirling spiritual possibilities into one single experienced reality. Your mind isn't just seeking justice, it's actively shaping the entire spiritual playing field.
Which brings us to part two, the binary spirit.
Now, here is where the theology really gets treated like a literal mathematical equation. It reduces incredibly complex human spirituality down to precise binary variables. The text defines perfection as specifically maintaining the spirit within our consciousness. It argues that mankind's sins naturally separate us from this spirit, but when that spirit is actually present, it has the active power to transform human consciousness with love. So perfection here isn't just about moral goodness, it's the active, measurable maintenance of a literal spiritual presence running in your mind.
And this binary system is absolutely ruthless. The author assigns actual numerical values to the spiritual state. When the spirit variable equals exactly 0, meaning it's completely separated from consciousness because of sin, the equation is pretty dark. A spirit of 0 mathematically results in pure enmity and hatred, like zero middle ground, just absolute hatred.
But watch what happens to the output if we just flip that binary variable over to a 1. When the spirit variable equals 1, meaning it's actively present in our consciousness, the mathematical result is love, peace, and joy. It's literally a binary system of the soul, guys. 0 is absolute hatred, and 1 is absolute love.
Moving on to part 3, the cycle of crime. So, now that we have the spiritual variables done, the text shifts gears to explain the actual mechanics of human conflict. How do these states interact in the real world? Well, the cycle unfolds chronologically. It always kicks off with the victim. Then there's an act, which could be psychological or physical. And finally, that results in justice. But how is justice actually defined here? The author claims that if the law of God is truth, then justice means the persecutor inevitably becomes the victim by the end of the cycle. Divine justice in this theology is just a closed, unavoidable loop of cause and effect.
That takes us to part 4, the psychological quantum game.
While physical crimes are pretty straightforward, the source text gets incredibly specific about modern psychological acts of victimhood. The author argues that in psychological persecution, there are these highly designed scripts created by psychologists or behaviorists that are essentially played directly on the human brain. These scripts produce emotions so real they can actually be measured with gadgets. The text talks about a hidden victim trapped inside these fictional scripts. The psychologist isn't trying to heal anyone, they're playing what's called a quantum mechanics of control. They're manipulating spiritual variables just to validate their own facts within a finite boundary condition. Just let this quote sink in for a second. It means, I have not done anything, but I'm suffering. That really hits the core human experience behind all this dense quantum theology, doesn't it? It perfectly describes the profound alienation of being a hidden victim, trapped in someone else's psychological script, enduring real, measurable pain without ever committing a physical action to actually deserve it.
And this illustrates just how wildly tangled this theological web really gets.
Imagine person A making a trustful transaction with person B while secretly hating and envying them. At the exact same time, person A is trying to rescue victim V. Then enter the obsessed behaviorist who actually splits their own personality into a rescuer and a coach, specifically to deliberately measure the sin happening in this chaos. And surrounding the whole shebang, an infinite number of watchers called N observers, who persecute the subjects using those probable behavior scripts. It is a completely dizzying web of psychological manipulation and spiritual observation.
So what is the ultimate theological point of all these observers and twisted scripts? Well, the author's conclusion is surprisingly dark. The text claims that God actually created authority specifically to trap the human mind with sin and death. All these forceful transactions inevitably lead to predestined suffering of the mind, body, and soul. According to this framework, the only possible escape from this divine trap, literally the only state where you don't suffer, is achieving the absolute, borderline impossible state of not committing sin at all.
Finally, we arrive at Part 5, the ultimate divine test.
We've covered the binary spirit, the cycles of crime, and the psychological traps. Now we get to see how all these variables crash together to reveal the big picture. It raises a really profound theological question for us. In a system so deeply wired with cycles of pain, persecution, and psychological suffering, does suffering equal salvation? Does enduring this intense, predestined quantum game actually earn you some kind of spiritual wisdom?
The answer, according to the text, is a hard no. Suffering does absolutely not equal salvation or wisdom. The author points out a fascinating theological paradox. God, who is described as the most perfect being, created the world with love. And yet, despite all that love, it's fundamentally uncertain if his creations are actually perfect. The suffering we endure in these psychological traps isn't some noble higher path to spiritual enlightenment. It's literally just a brutal byproduct of the system.
In fact, the text frames the entire system like this. Yes, this is the test of God to evolve beyond the intelligence of the Creator himself, but humans fail in every attempt to be the most perfect beings. Just think about the sheer magnitude of that claim. The whole quantum game of justice, the spiritual zeros and ones, the psychological scripts, it's all framed as this radical divine test. A test daring humanity to literally evolve beyond the intelligence of the Creator. And tragically, the text says it's a test that we fail in every single attempt.
To wrap up their theory, the author makes an incredibly bold, almost mystical final claim. They state that, by the grace of God, they've personally interacted with every single personality God has ever created. They claim to completely understand how every person thinks, the very nature of how they exist, and the exact, specific style of psychological or physical persecution they perform. Essentially, the author is claiming to have pulled off the impossible, mapping every single variable in this massive divine equation.
Which leaves us with this final, staggering thought to chew on. If we really are living inside a spiritual equation governed by finite emotional states, binary spiritual variables, and obsessed observers, can humanity ever actually pass the ultimate quantum test to evolve beyond its creator? Or are we just forever trapped in a predestined cycle of psychological scripts? It's an incredibly fascinating intersection of abstract science and complex theology. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it helped make sense of these huge ideas for you.